Welcome back to our tutorial series from Little Free Fibrary. This month we're going to be focusing on our June block of the month, which is the Sawtooth Star. And in your kit you have an instruction booklet. You've got a set of a needle and some pins. You've got some thread. You should have 4 plain squares, 4 plain triangles, 8 colorful triangles, and 1 very large square to make your block. And you should also have a return envelope to contribute your block to our community quilt when you're done. So the first thing the instructions tell me to do is that I want to draw sewing lines on the wrong sides of all of my fabric pieces. And basically all I need to do is draw a line 1/4 inch in from the edge of each of my pieces. I like to use my quilting ruler for this because it's really easy just to line up the edge of the fabric with one of these lines, 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, 1 inch, etc. But you can use any kind of ruler that you have. You could even cut a strip of cardboard that's 1/4 inch wide and use it as a kind of jig. And I just use a pencil and I'm just going to gently trace that sewing line on here. I'm going to do it on all the sides of all of my pieces. If it shifts a little bit, just shove it back into place, because you want to make sure that those lines are as accurate as possible. A lot of patchwork does rely on accuracy, so the more accurate you can be, the better results you're going to have in your finished block. So you can see I have all of my lines on here. Now be careful when you're tracing the triangles. These long edges, the edges on the diagonal, are a little bit stretchier than some of these other edges. So you just want to be careful that when you're drawing on them, you're not stretching them out. Now this is a white solid fabric, so it doesn't really matter which side is the front or the back, or what we call the right side or the wrong side, or the pretty side. But when I am doing my printed fabrics, I want to make sure that my lines are drawn on what we call the wrong side of the fabric. So this is what we would call the right side of the fabric. This back side is what we call the wrong side of the fabric. And so I want to make sure that that is the side that I draw my lines on. If you are going to be sewing your block on a sewing machine, if you want, you can still draw these lines. I find them very helpful. Some sewing machines have specific feet, 1/4 inch foot that has a little flange on it that just tells you exactly where to line it up for a 1/4 inch seam, but not all sewing machines do, so it can still be quite helpful to draw the lines, especially if you're a beginner. It just helps sort of keep you on track. So I'm going to go ahead and draw lines on all of my pieces. I've drawn lines on all of my pieces, and then the instructions tell me that the first thing we're going to do is make the points of the star. And we're going to make 4 sets of these, and these are the points right on the outside of the star. There's 8 points on this star. We're going to make 4 units where we have this white triangle in here and then a colorful triangle on either side. So we've got my white triangle, and I'm going to put a colorful triangle on either side to make that unit. So these will be the points of my star. This is also in patchwork. Traditionally, it's called a flying geese unit. This is your goose. This is the air, and your goose is flying through the air. I don't know, that's what people tell me. Or this is the goose and this is the sky. I've also heard it called that. But basically, we're going to attach these colorful triangles to this piece one at a time. So I'm going to scooch this one out of my way for a little bit. And I want to make sure that I'm attaching the correct sides of the triangle that's going to work out right. I don't want to put like this, right? That doesn't match. There's too much of a gap here. So I want to make sure that I have my triangles aligned correctly. And notice this makes a little square in the corner. and this has a little gap right there, and that is exactly the way it's supposed to be. I'm gonna flip this triangle on here, and what I want to do is I want to very carefully match up that little flat spot on the bottom, and I want to match this up along here. And if this doesn't meet the point, that is okay. That is the way that it's supposed to be. And I'm going to go ahead and pin that in place. Just so it doesn't shift around. Again, we're striving for as much accuracy as possible here, especially anywhere where we know points are going to meet. But you can see this is nice and flat, and there is that little tip. You'll see when I open up this block and I add the next piece why that's there. So I have that ready to go, and then next I'm going to sew it. I've threaded my needle. You're certainly welcome to sew this on a sewing machine, but not everybody has one, and you know, hand sewing is a useful skill to have. It helps you mend your clothes, do lots of other things. I'm just going to tie a knot in the end of my thread, and I'm going to start at one end and move to the other end using a running stitch, where I basically just go up and down along the line. So I'm going to go in, not right exactly at the edge because then it's just going to fall off, but I'm going to go close to the edge, maybe about 1/8 of an inch away, and I'm just going to pull that thread through. Now I have this long tail. I don't necessarily want it that long, but I don't want to cut off right next to the knot because I never want my knot to unravel. So I usually cut it off about 1/4 of an inch away. And that way it's not hanging out, getting in my way, or disrupting anything. So I'm going to go just along this line that I've drawn, up through both layers, back down through both layers. And I want to make my stitches, I usually make my stitches about 1/8 of an inch apart. If you can go smaller, that's great. The smaller you can go, sort of the more secure it will be. But you don't want to go too much bigger, because then when you open it up, you'll get a lot of gapping and it just won't be as securely made. So aim for about 1/8 of an inch apart. You don't have to measure it. It doesn't have to be perfect. We're here to practice. We're not here to make it perfect. And really the only way that you make it perfect is through practice. People sometimes ask me like, oh, how are your stitches so neat? How are they so tiny? Well, you know, I've been doing this years. So, you know, the more you do this, the easier it gets and the better your end product gets. So it really is like, you know, learning to run a marathon or learning to play piano, right? It's not going to happen without practice. So make sure that you pick up a kit every month so you can practice more and make a new block and learn all sorts of different quilt blocks, you know, sewing squares to squares, sewing triangles to triangles, lots of different things to practice. when I get near the end, I want to get as close to the end as possible without going over, right? A little bit like The Price is Right for those of you of my age and generation. So I'm pretty close to the end. I'm going to come up about 1/8 of an inch away from the end. And now I need to secure my thread. I don't want to just cut it off and leave it dangle because then my stitching is just going to unravel. So I'm going to make a knot. There are lots of different ways you can make a knot. You could cut this thread right off here because I have 2 threads, and I could just tie them together. That's one pretty easy way to make a knot. I find it's kind of irritating sometimes. My thread gets twisted up as I work and it takes a while to untwist it. This is the knot that I learned to make when I was learning patchwork. So I have my thread coming out and I have my needle, and I'm basically going to make a loop by putting it back through the nearest stitch. And I'm going to sort of make this loop around my thumb so that you can see it. So I'm just pulling this through, pulling my thread through until I have about a thumb-sized loop. You can see that loop there. Now, instead of going straight back through it, I'm going to go through it from the back side. So I'm going to come under and through, and then I'm going to pull it tight until it makes a knot. And then sometimes I'm a little paranoid about how secure it might be. Sometimes it feels a little loose to me, so I just make 2. I just do it the exact same thing again. I make that loop, and then I come up from the bottom through the loop and through, and then pull it tight. And that basically makes a double knot. Trim my thread about 1/4 inch away, and ta-da! I've sewn the first point of my star. I'm going to open this up. Look at how beautiful that is. Now, I want to make sure to press my seam on the back, and I want to do my best to press it toward the colorful block, like this. If you have an iron, it's super great for pressing down, but you can just use your fingers. Sometimes I like to use the side of my ruler or a book or anything that's really flat and kind of has a really nice kind of crisp edge. And I'll do it on the back first, and then I'll come around to the front. Make sure not to stretch it. Remember, those triangle edges can be really stretchy. We're not here to stretch it out. We just want it to lie flat. And the reason we want to press it toward the colorful block is 2 reasons. One, this block is very light in color, and if we press that fabric toward that side, sometimes we can see through. So when we're all done, we might be seeing the pattern coming through. Not always, you know, it really depends. If this was, you know, a dark color like a gray or a black, we could certainly press it that way. But when we're making these type of units, these flying geese units or these star points units, by pressing this to the back, it's going to help us have a flatter block overall when we're done and really reduce the bulk. And it's going to help us put this second piece on. So that if this was this way and we put it on, we have maybe more trouble sort of lining up that point and sewing everything through, and it gets really bulky when we start to flip this one open. So I find it works out just a little bit better and easier if we press it toward that colorful side. And so the next thing I need to do is just my second star point. So I'm going to line up this block, and I'm going to line it up exactly the same way. I'm going to flip it over, line up these little end pieces here, this little square, line this up against the edge. And notice now, remember before we had sort of that point sticking up and it looked a little weird? Notice that the top edge of this triangle lines up perfectly exactly with that one. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that great? Look at how accurate that is. So I'm going to pin this one down in a couple spots. And I like to pin this one sort of right through where that point is that I've drawn, where my lines cross, and that should go right through the point on the other side. That's going to make sure I have a really beautiful, lovely, crisp point when I'm done. I'm going to go ahead and sew this on my sewing machine mostly for speed, but then you can also see what the difference is. Okay, I've finished sewing my second triangle onto my flying geese unit. This one I've sewn by machine, and you can see my stitching line there. You can see it pretty much aligns with my pencil line. I'm gonna open this up. Ta-da! I have my flying geese unit. I'm gonna press this down so it's nice and flat. Remember pressing it away from the goose, toward the sky, toward those more colorful triangles. Now I have 1 star point, 2 star points, but I'm making an 8-pointed star, so I'm going to need 3 more of these units. So I have that one made. Oh, look, 2, 3, and 4. I have 4 star units total to make. The next thing I want to do is make the top and bottom rows. So I'm going to make a row across here. There's sort of 3 rows to this block. There's a skinny row, there's a fat row with that big square in the middle, and then there's another skinny row on the bottom. So the first thing I'm going to do is make these top and bottom rows. And the most important thing is I need to make sure that my triangles and my points are all going in the directions that I want them to. So I need to make a top row where my points are pointing up, and I need to make a bottom row where my points are pointing down. And to make these rows, basically I just need to put one of the smaller white squares on either side. So that's sort of what each row is going to look like, maybe a little less wonky. And so I'm just going to sew this to this. I'm going to flip this over. I'm going to draw my sewing lines and sew right there. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side with this one. Draw my sewing lines, sew it together, and flip it open. And then I'm going to do the same with the bottom row. I'll be right back. Okay, so I've sewn my 2 squares on the sides, and I'm just going to open them up just like that. I want to press them down. Now notice I'm pressing these toward the square side. I think, you know, these ones you could press either way, but I think these ones, based on what we do in the center, is going to help line it up a little bit more. But notice that it is a little bit darker, and you can see a little hint of a shadow through there. So that's personal option. You may press them either way that you wish. And this is my top row, so my points face up. And this is my bottom row, so my points face down. Now the final row I'm going to complete is this middle row, and it has points on either side and the big square in the middle. So here's my big square, and here are my 2 remaining points blocks. Now I want to make sure that my star points point out. I don't want to make a little triangle like this. I want it to look like a star. And I'm always going back and checking against the picture so that I know that I have it lined up the right way, because you know me, I'm going to end up doing something like this where I sew one the correct way and one the other way, and that's okay. Like, look, I made a cool fish head with a tail. Like, if that's how you want to put your block together, again, there's no quilt authorities. I'm not going to come to your house and, you know, chastise you. We've had some beautiful blocks sent in already where people have taken creative license with some of the shapes that we've sent out. So absolutely, and if you do this, and if you do it by mistake and you just don't want to undo it, then like lean into it, you know? But you can also just always keep referencing the picture to see what it looks like. So in terms of this one, first, basically I'm just going to, you know, flip this onto this side. I'm going to move this one out of the way for now. And here's a case where I do probably want to use my pins a little bit. I could zoom in a little bit here so we can see a little bit closer. I'm going to turn this because this is probably how I'm going to hold it when I sew it, and I want to line this up as close as possible. Now it might be a little bit wonky. Again, that's okay. I want to line this up so the point is in the middle and you can see sort of where my stitching lines cross. That's where I want to put my pin through. And that's where I want my seam to go. I sewed these on the machine so they don't have lines, but yours might have lines on it, and those are the lines that you want to follow when you're sewing. So I'm going to put a pin right in the middle, and then I'm going to put a pin just on either side of this block. Now I'm going to sew straight across, and I want to make sure that when I sew this block, I want my sewing line to go right across that point, right where that pin is. If I put it up here, then my points aren't going to match up. If I sew my seam down here, I'm going to have flat top triangles. So I want to sew as closely as possible. And the thing is, this is actually something that's easier when you're doing it by hand, to get it, put your needle right in that point. This is actually a lot trickier to do. You know, we think sewing machines are a lot easier and faster, and in many ways they are, but sometimes they're just not as accurate. So I'm going to go ahead and sew this one on the machine, and then show you what that seam looks like and open it up and see what we get. Okay, here we are, the big reveal. I've got my top row sewn, I've got my bottom row sewn, and let's see how beautiful this star looks. And we open it up, we press it down. Lovely, just lovely. I got a little bit of a flat top on one of my rows there. Are you gonna notice it from a galloping horse 20 feet away? Absolutely not. It looks beautiful. Press it all out, nice and flat. Pop it in your envelope, send it back to me so that I can add it into our community quilt. And don't forget to take a photograph, post it online, tag us on Instagram at littlefreefibrary, send us an email at lff@archivy.net, and we look forward to seeing what you make. Stay tuned for next month's block.